Hello everyone, I'm Nayaswami Asha, and we're continuing our study of the essence of self-realization, the wisdom of Paramhansa Yogananda, and we're up to chapter 17. And this chapter is called How to Pray Effectively. I was going to say it's a marvelous chapter, but you all must be tired of hearing me say that, because every time I have a chapter, I say this chapter is so exciting, because it is. It's so exciting. So, we're going to talk this time about prayer. Master starts out, sometimes when you're reading Master's teachings and his writings, of course what he did is a treasure against time. It has no, it doesn't expire. It has no expiration date. It doesn't after a while become inapplicable. It applies from the beginning to the end of time, because that's the journey that the soul is on. An avatar is born with the state of perfect self-realization, but as soon as he incarnates, he then becomes bound by the culture in which he's incarnated and the karma of his disciples. And so it's also sometimes interesting to remember that Master was in America from 1920 to 1952, which in American history was quite a long time ago, in the sense that our culture has shifted so radically since then. So sometimes you have to look just a little, with a little bit of culture, to hear what Master is talking about. But even things which have to do with external culture also have to do with our own inner relationship with God. So it's a very minor adjustment. Jesus used lots of examples about wheat and about sheep, which are not things that we mostly know about. But it's a very small thing to expand ourselves into an understanding of that. So Master starts talking about the tradition of formal prayer. And for many people in the West, especially prior to the 60s, 1960s, and everything that's happened since then, when sort of whole culture kind of turned around, prior to that, people's idea of spirituality was pretty much the same as their idea of religion. And so people took their understanding of their own relationship with God from a formal church setting and from the dogmas and the traditions of those churches. And of course, especially when Master was teaching, that was really just what everyone thought. He really launched the revolution which you would have to call as a moving away from religion into spirituality. Spirituality, this is the way I think of it at least, spirituality can also take you into a religion. And in a religion, you can also be deeply spiritual. Spiritual is your own inner state of consciousness. And religion is how you may express that consciousness. You may express it through the traditional forms of any of the world's religion. And if what your world's religions, and if what you're expressing is your own actual experience, then you have made your religion spiritual. But it's also quite possible to participate in a religion and not really have any deep sense of spirituality, just because it's the form, it's what you do, it's what your family does, it's what your society does. In Europe, for example, the Catholic Church is as much a social institution as a religious one, and even people who become disciples of the Kriya path, at least it was, maybe less so now, it's like, of course they would still keep going to church. What their meditation and their spiritual life was quite different than their church life. So in this whole concept, of course, church has a certain formality to prayer. We pray the Lord's Prayer, which of course is a fairly intimate one, but there's a whole structure of how prayers and services are carried out, with responses and rote comments and so on. Now, I'm not against that sort of thing when the writing is inspired, when the original poetry is inspired. Every time you read it, you can go deeper into it. Master said about his whispers from eternity that they were prayers in which he felt the divine response. And when you read those prayers, you go, as he described it, you go through them to the true divine response. My family was Jewish. I grew up in the Jewish tradition, not not very seriously religious, but nonetheless that was our ethnicity and our culture. And I didn't attend temple very much, and long after I'd come to Ananda, one year I happened to be visiting my parents during what's called the High Holy Days of Judaism, which is Rosh Hashanah leading into Yom Kippur. And I went with my father to the synagogue, just why not? And I had the prayer book in my hand, which is the rituals that are followed, moving here and there throughout the book. And I got lost in reading the book because the book was marvelous. It just had beautifully universal in the sense of true spirituality, the soul in God, not Jewish specific. It was filled with deep wisdom. The rabbi, unfortunately, I didn't understand his prayer book. And I was looking for spirituality. He kept giving us religion. And, half his talk was just about being Jewish and then using a lot of Hebrew because that's the language that they use. But he didn't understand really how to commune with God. In my fantasy, I wanted to walk up and tap him on the shoulder and say, "Excuse me, Rabbi, just give me 10 minutes on the mic, and I can really pull this group together." But I had enough sense to realize that wasn't a good idea. So what Master's saying here, in essence, is that too much formality in our prayers, unless you have taken that ritual and by the repeating nature of it, made it a doorway into infinity for yourself. But then you wouldn't have to be hearing this. But too much formality in our prayer, having the words given to us too much, inhibits communication rather than facilitates it. It would be as if every time you talk to the people in your family, you were reading from a script. I mean, sometimes it's nice. "Here, darling, let me read you Shakespeare's sonnet about perfect romantic love," and you pour your heart into those beautiful words, and it deepens your relationship because the words are so beautiful. But if every time your wife says, "Do you love me, darling?" you have to stop and look up something and read it out of a book, naturally there's a certain lack of spontaneity there. And we have to understand that our relationship with God is more intimate than any human relationship that we can have. Whatever human contacts we have are always limited by our essential identification with two separate realities. Even if we're in great harmony and there's an enormous vibrational sharing, nonetheless, as long as I am identified with my ego and all of the limiting individuality that gives me, or the one that I love is, then we can only come so close. And people in sexuality and other ways try to push through that sense of separateness, but it can never be bridged. It can only be bridged by transcending the ego. Now, our relationship with God, by contrast, we have to realize that the divine, as Master talks further in this chapter, is the animating reality of our entire existence, that there is no other. Earlier in an earlier chapter where we were talking, actually it was just the chapter just before this one, which is ways in which God can be worshipped. We talked about how even for those who have great realization, the I-thou relationship with God is still very sweet. But the thou that we're speaking of, the divine thou, lives within our own heart. And the separation that we feel so much, that's so anguishing among individuals, is not there with God. And so in such a relationship, at times we enjoy poetry, at times we enjoy ritual, at times we enjoy ceremony, but at other times we just want to be ourselves. And we just want to talk as naturally and sincerely to God as we would talk to our best friends, because He is. There's a very touching story told by a friend of mine about the Christian missionary named Frank Laubach. Frank Laubach was a deeply spiritual, mystical man, and he was a committed Christian and went on missionary adventures through the Philippines, I believe, and other places. Maybe it wasn't the Philippines, because it seems like the people he was meeting were Muslim, but that's beside the point. I can't at the moment remember where he was. But finding himself with a great deal of time on his hands, he began to experiment with creating a unity of consciousness with Jesus. He wrote a beautiful book called Letters from a Modern Mystic, and he had a practice of remembering God a minute at a time. Beautiful soul, deep mystical soul. And the parents of a friend of mine were also training to be missionaries, and Frank Laubach came as a guest teacher to the Catholic Christian college where they were attending, and he was asked to lead the prayer before dinner. And he stood up and he led a prayer like they had never really heard before. And afterwards they said this about him: it was as if at all times Frank Laubach was in conversation with God, conversation with Christ, who was his Ishtadeva, the one he worships. And when he prayed in front of the group, it was as if he made audible for a period of time that ongoing conversation, and then at a certain point just went back into the internal dialogue. And of course they'd never heard anyone pray like that. They'd never heard anyone pray as if God were the closest friend that I can have, and I'm always talking to Him, even as I talk to myself, even as I reflect in my own mind about my own thoughts and my own ideas. God is listening. Divine Mother is listening. However, whatever your Ishta Deva is, whatever your chosen form of the divine, the master, the guru, if you like, He's always there, because He knows every single thought that we think. And whether we're passive in that, and therefore draw nothing of His magnetism, or whether we are actively engaged in that ongoing relationship so that everything that we do becomes a partnership, then this is the difference. This is what Master's urging upon us, is to understand that that it's a relationship with God. It's not a role that we play. It's not, oh, now I'm being a devotee and now I'm going to pray and this is what I say. Not at all. It's a relationship, and a relationship is the spontaneous, ongoing sharing of everything that we are. In this also, I remember I was with a group of clergymen, and it was the first time I'd been with a group of clergy people who were more religious than spiritual. And it was very interesting to me that they had different personas. We were on a retreat together. I was actually being asked to teach them to meditate. And when we were just being ourselves, they had one persona. And then when, for circumstances, they were asked to lead grace or something like that, then they would have another persona. And it was painful to me to see that. Because why would you not be everything that you are with God? It reminds me, as I think I've told in this series, when we were telling a local clergyman who was a friend of ours in a completely other tradition, an acquaintance really, we were having lunch, we told him we were starting a community that was 25 years ago. He said, why? Isn't seeing those people on Sunday enough? And it just made us, we were completely taken aback. Because for him, even though he is a sincere spiritual person, it's still a little bit compartmentalized in his mind. Whereas in our path of self-realization, every minute is the same. Being a devotee is not a role. It's a self-definition, that I'm devoted to God, and everything that will facilitate that devotion, including serving others by having a community and being with others who are also on the path. Sunday's not enough. Nothing is enough. 24 hours a day, every minute of a day. That's who we want to be spiritually. And in this context, Master also says to us something that's really very important. He says, sometimes we think that that the things that cause us to waffle from the clarity of our devotion are obstacles to our prayer. And Master tells us that we should make them the subject of our prayer. And so he says there, if your heart is restless with desires, pray to him. Lord, I have these desires, but I want you more than anything else. Help me to dissolve every limitation. So if it's right, I often have felt that those things that actually disturb my meditation are often serious messages from God, because they tell me what my consciousness is doing. Because when we try to focus our attention in meditation, or our hearts in communion with God, then we find out where our energy is really pulling. And sometimes it's pulling in ways that, at least speaking for myself, that I may not have been aware of. And so not only do these off-center desires or habits, whatever they are, not only is it informative to realize, to see yourself for what you are, but then also that gives you the subject of your prayer. Isn't that what you would do with a friend? You would say to your friend, look, I'm trying to follow a non-gluten diet. I'm trying to meditate every morning. Will you meet me at 6 o'clock and we'll go to the temple together? Or will you call me and wake me up? Or can we go out and exercise together? You ask your friend to help you. You don't pretend to your friend that you're making no effort to become a better person. Why would we withhold that fact from God? And whom should we ask for help, if not the one who can help us? So Master really emphasizes that, and that's the most important starting point for prayer. And then, yes, for example, in our Sunday service, Ananda Sunday service, we do the Festival of Light, and we do it every week. And it has certain prayers: with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind, and with all my strength, I choose thy love, I choose only thee. And we repeat that word by word. From darkness lead us to light, from death to immortality, from sorrow to infinite joy. And we repeat those formally each time. It's just, a light touch, it's not. But the ritual then repeats, 15 minutes of a repeating ritual. But you can pray like that also. Formal prayers have their place, especially when they're in a cycle, every Sunday, almost every Sunday, you come, and here we are again. I choose thy love, I choose thy love. From darkness into light, from sorrow into joy. And you reaffirm that deeply. And what that also does is that increases your intimacy. Because the other part of this is, and Master speaks of this toward the end, the prayers that are part of Master's writing and of what Swami has given us are conversations. They're not about, oh, glorious, all-powerful, omnipotent, one who created the universe, which it's all right. Master says at the end of this chapter, he says it always amuses him when he hears people praising God. He said, as if God needs to be praised. He says he thinks sometimes of as he puts it, a rich old woman sitting there wanting everyone to flatter her. It's quite different when it's a spontaneous outpouring of gratitude from your own heart. And even that has a place, about how glorious the divine can be. But too much of prayer, as Swamiji says, is about God, and it's not to God. I mean, where does it take us to talk about God? Well, there's one where that it does take us, and Master himself, I marked it in the chapter ways in which God can be worshipped. Remember the conversations about what is the nature of God or so on. You can go back and listen to that again if you like. But Master, who's having a discussion in this particular entry I'm referring back to in chapter 16, with a very intellectual person who wants God to be precisely defined. And Master says the goal of religion is not to define God accurately. It is to inspire people the desire to commune with Him. And so much of what Master does is just trying to inspire people with the desire to commune with Him. And Master says how God is, the saints and sages liken God to those pleasures and joyful experiences that we already know, so that it will turn us toward the thought, well, if I'm enjoying that, and he promises me that this is just a shadow of what the divine is, maybe I ought to check out this God consciousness thing and see if it can take me somewhere. So in this very section of the book, Swamiji is quoting Master. Union with the cosmic beloved is the most enjoyable experience possible. It is dream after dream, joy after joy, 1,000 million divine romances in one, ever thrilling your heart. In every point of space you behold searchlights of His love, shining like 1,000,000 suns. As often as you think you have exhausted His love, again and again, like a rolling surf, it crashes anew upon the shores of your mind. And then Master says, that is ecstasy, just like that. Now, in a certain sense, that's, but it's not praising God, it's descriptive. It's descriptive of the experience. And Master's illustrating his own point. It is the purpose of saints and sages and avatars to inspire us to want that. How can you not want that? 1,000 million divine romances in one, ever thrilling your heart. Just think how we pine away for that certain someone to come, or we become so enamored of that someone when he does come. And he speaks of 1,000 million divine romances. And it just takes our consciousness and breaks apart the edges, doesn't it? And makes us eager for that relationship, which is exactly the point. We don't want to just praise God in this formal, holding Him at a distance way. We want that ecstasy. Who would not want it? Even if we don't understand it. There's the consciousness of Master behind it. Swamiji was, I was listening to something he was saying recently, and he was talking about public speaking, not really public speaking, but the speaking of God and self-realization. And Swamiji was talking about how important it is to be magnetic, and how important it is to be expansive with your vibrations. And he made the very simple statement. He says, people learn from your vibrations more than from your words. Isn't that interesting? And Swamiji talked about how when he speaks, he spreads his vibration and so it fills the entire hall. I remember in the late 70s, I was with Swamiji in San Francisco at a very large program. He was part of a larger program, and there were 700 people in the room, which in those days for us was a very large crowd. And it was a rather large hall, and because I was half on the crew, I, instead of taking a regular seat, I was sitting on a piece of equipment in the very back with my back up against the back wall. And when Swami began to speak, it was a very dynamic evening in any case, for many reasons. And Swamiji was, from the moment he opened his mouth, the divine was just pouring through him. I'm sitting as far away from him as I can be and still in the same room with my back against the wall. And I think, wow, this is an excellent sound system, because I felt Swamiji just right here, which is how I've often described how I felt when I first met him. But in this hall, I'm looking at all these people, and I felt Swami was talking right here. And that's when I first thought, what an excellent sound system. And then I realized it's not the sound system, Asha, it's his presence. He had just pushed his energy to the back wall, and I was at the back wall, and he was as much with me as if I'd been 1 foot away from him. And when that vibration of consciousness comes to us, what happens is the energy in our spine straightens, our energy internalizes, and the energy rises. And it's the vibration that shifts us. And then we hear the words. And we know the words have to go through a filter. What does that word mean? What does that concept mean? It's vicarious. But the vibration is direct because we're all made of Om. And the vibration that Swamiji is projecting to us is the Om vibration. And that particular tone of the Om, in all circumstances, is a more subtle and a more elevated vibration than my own. So when I receive his vibration, then all of a sudden I attune to that. That's attunement. That's how real spiritual progress is made, is by matching that vibration. Because when you match the vibration, then you can understand the words. But otherwise, you don't understand them, because their meaning is not intellectual. Their meaning is vibratory. I had a habit when Swami was speaking, I developed toward the end, which I really enjoyed. When he would speak, I would try to concentrate so deeply, and I was more or less successful, but this was my practice, that I was completely in the now, and that I would follow him word by word. And I would just try to take each word as he offered it and just be in those words with him, not have my mind distracted, not anticipating, oh, I've heard this story before, I know where it's going. Just literally, the joy of God, hear each one. And I became very conscious from that practice that Swami was creating a vibration first, and then he was putting a word on it. And that the thoughts and the ideas that were flowing through him were a lesser expression of the vibration that was flowing through him. But the vibration came first, not the thoughts and the words. When Master talks about reading his own whispers from eternity, he challenges us in the introduction to overcome the limiting factor of ink and paper and to actually find the God communion that's behind it. Now, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about being in that kind of intimacy with the divine power, that all of the means that we use are superficial, because what we really have is a heart-to-heart. And of course, there's no room in that for holding back or trying to put on a nice face or pretending to be something we're not, assuming a role. How can a relationship thrive if you don't bring your authentic self to it? And that's where Master's talking to us about just be yourself and be in love with God, or at least be in longing to be in love. You know, just the way I was always interested in, getting married, but I wasn't a terrible romantic. I performed a wedding for a friend. Later, her maid of honor, who was her cousin, said that the two girls had been planning their wedding since they were 5 years old. I don't know how common that is or not. It was certainly not my life. Never, ever, ever once thought about it. They'd been planning theirs for 30 years. So I was not that kind of person. But I had a longing for romance and husband and family and so on like that. And as a young teenager, you dream of those things a little bit. So we long to be in love. That's what I was saying. So even if we aren't in love with God, we should long to be in love. In fact, Master tells us the most important thing to pray for is to pray to love God. Because when you love, all technique, all discipline, all effort, all willpower is just gone. It's just the way it is. And if you've ever been a parent, which I haven't been, but I certainly understand it from past lives, the parent doesn't have to think about their newborn child. they can hardly stand to be away from the child, and they'll get up in the middle of the night just to watch the baby breathe, partly out of fear that he might stop breathing, but also just to watch him breathe and just stare at him while he sleeps, waiting for him to wake up again. There's no discipline in that. You can't help yourself. Now that's how we should love God. That's what it really takes. We have to have that. 1,000 million divine romances do not come from indifference. They come from a wholehearted, whole person commitment. That's what prayer is, a wholehearted, whole person commitment. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy mind, with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, because there is no other reality. The Master really makes a point of that. It takes concentration, it takes energy. As Master puts it so sweetly, God answers all prayers, but distracted prayers he answers only a little. He gives you back, in other words, about what you give him. You give God a quarter or a tiny fraction of your attention, and you get back proportionally. It was interesting. We were on a trip to Italy. We were actually on a spiritual pilgrimage with Swamiji a number of years ago, some decades ago, maybe in the 80s. And I think I have this correct, but the time and place are unimportant. It's to the lesson. I think it was in Siena, in Italy, where Catherine of Siena lived, but it might have been some other city like that. We went to one of the churches which had relics of a saint. That's why I think it was Siena. And they were telling this story about a time when hundreds of years before, when some of the consecrated holy wafers had been stolen from the church. And once those wafers are consecrated, they cease to be flour and water. They become symbolically the body of Christ. So for consecrated holy wafers to be taken out of the church and desecrated in that way, especially at the time that this happened, it was a cause of enormous concern. It was blasphemous, and it was frightening to the town. And so the story is told that, quote, the whole town prayed. And then somehow there was some kind of a miracle. I don't think it was just the miracle of the thieves walking back in, but something happened. Maybe there was an everlasting host that never decayed or something like that. Forgive me for not knowing the details. But the story is told that everybody in town prayed, and so this miracle happened. Swamiji just sort of turns. He said, there must have been a saint praying. And then later when we talked about it, he said, one restless prayer, 100 restless prayers are not more powerful than one restless prayer. It's not like all those people who are more worldly in their consciousness, just because there's 1,000 of them, the whole prayer doesn't rise to any higher level than their individual consciousnesses. Swami he wasn't really putting down the citizens of that town, but he was, in a sense, an ordinary town. Just merely because they all pray, it's not going to create a miracle. Because their vibration simply is what it is. And if nobody is there to lift their vibration, they'll just all have the same. That's why I said there must have been a saint who was praying. Because somebody had real communion with the divine and really pulled the divine power into the moment. It's an interesting thought, because people imagine that this world is going to be repaired and made into a beautiful and better place if we all just start thinking good thoughts or something like that. But I just realized in thinking about that, 1,000 restless, egoic-minded people are not less egoic-minded just because there's 1,000 of them. And the universe is not necessarily going to respond, because it's a magnetic universe. And a lot of people vibrating on a certain wavelength would just keep vibrating on that wavelength. It's not transformative unless it's actually lifted higher than that, which is why the relationship with God is so personal, why we have to receive that vibration. Because when we receive that vibration, that's when we move into a whole another realm of possibility. Master encourages us to be fervent in our prayer. We're too timid, especially in the West, less so in India, less so in Italy, where in Italy they have a greater tradition of saints, and as a culture it's more intuitive and more heart-centered. Enthusiasm from the heart is more natural. to the Italian people, as an example. Ananda has a work in Italy, so I tend to think of Italy when I think of Europe. And just the way those people move from the heart. When Swami Kriyananda went there, people just recognize him. They know what a saint is, and they feel it, and they move with their hearts there. In the West, we're always wanting to be so careful. We don't want to be, we never want to appear to be gullible. I've commented before, great American virtue is to be shrewd. It does not serve us in religion. Swami Master here tells the story of a monk at Mount Washington, American, probably, who was very fervent in his devotion and made a lot of noise and a lot of commotion, and many of the other monks were quite put off by this. But the monk wrote a note to Master, is this all right? And Master said, you should roll on the ground with your fervor for God. Now bear in mind, Master also had more than a few uncomplimentary things to say about the holy rollers, the Holy Ghost of emotion, he called it, rather than the Holy Ghost of devotion. So mere outwardness is not a sign of deep inwardness. But in this context, I'm remembering that Master makes a comment. It may be in the Autobiography of a Yogi, or else it's somewhere else. But before Master met Sri Yukteswar, he became very devoted to the very saintly soul who's known as Master Mahashaya, which just means Mr. Great Soul. Master Mahashaya was a very advanced disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, and the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, which is verbatim notes from all his visits, was written by Master Mahashaya, who simply signed his name M. But in Autobiography of a Yogi, the blissful devotee is what he's called. And when you read between the lines a little bit of that chapter, or you simply read what's there and really cognize it in a very real way, you see what an extraordinarily close bond was formed between Master Mahashaya and Master Yogananda. And so much so that Master Mahashaya had to say to Yogananda, no, I'm not your guru. Your guru will come. But you can see what would have prompted him to say that, unless there was such an intimate bond between them. And the great regard that Yogananda had for Master Mahashaya, he said, I rolled on the ground where Master Mahashaya had walked. I rolled in the dust where Master Mahashaya had walked. Now that level of spontaneous devotion to this devotee, because this devotee, as is told in autobiography, interceded and gave Master so many divine experiences that are told in that chapter about the blissful devotee. How many times Master Mahashaya lifted Yogananda into divine states of ecstasy, as Yogananda tells the story, that his gratitude and his respect, he rolled on the ground. Now, just imagine just imagine that, especially in the West. Some holy person comes and you follow along behind them, because that's what it is. He walks past you and you roll in the dust where he's walked. I saw a film of Swami Shivananda of the Divine Life Society in Rishikesh. Shivananda died also in the 60s. And there's just a picture of some sadhus coming to visit Shivananda. And Shivananda walks by and this man just falls on the ground and rolls in the dust. When you're actually filming something that's divine, the difference between what is truly divinely inspired and what is merely, and Master warns us against this, an outward show. Just on this film, which I'm watching on on a TV screen, but like this, it was so it was so present. You could just tell. This is an old black and white film, but you can tell when that sadhu rolled along behind his guru, Shivananda, that it just came right out of his soul. There wasn't an ounce of pretense. It's a few seconds of black and white film, but the entire reality of it just communicated just like this. It was quite something. And I've never forgotten it. I went back a few times to just watch it over and over, just seconds. Just watching him go there. Watching the ecstasy of that experience come over the devotee. Speaking of that, there's a DVD that I saw once, and I have no idea what the title of it is. If anybody watching this finds it, please tell me. It was a documentary of someone who went around and filmed a lot of visionaries, people who had seen Mother Mary. And it was in many parts of the world, not famous visionaries like Medjugorje or Fatima in the past or Lourdes, but just Mary appearing all over the world. And there was one young girl in Africa, and they were interviewing her, and they were just talking to her, and while the camera was on her in the middle of this conversation, suddenly she had the vision. And I believe the whole film was interesting, but what I remember from it, and I saw it 25 years ago, was her face. Because there she was on camera and she was talking. You know, they were talking about spiritual things. She was talking about her visions. It wasn't a trivial conversation, but just faster than you could follow. She shifted in to a superconscious state, and she was seeing Mary, and everything shifted. Just like that. Vibrations are everything. She went from here to there, faster than I can turn my hand. And that's what we're seeking. And we can't get there timidly. It takes a deep commitment, and it takes constantly pulling ourselves back from where we habitually go. And it takes cooperation with grace. That's why Master says, don't hide your faults from God. Don't even think that your faults are, your faults are the subject. That's what I was saying. This is the project. We're working on this together, bearing in mind that God lives inside of you. He knows us better than we know ourselves. So there's no point in thinking I'm only going to talk to God about this, because everything else that's happening is part of the reality too. So just live as we live and make God our constant companion in it. Now we have a question. Let's hear what that question is.
Is being a disciple a role, or taking one of the other commitments like a Nayaswami a role?
Well, I guess the question is being a disciple a role? Is becoming a Nayaswami a role? But I mean, the question is related to, I suppose the impetus behind that question is, why would we do anything external if this is meant to be an internal relationship? And there's kind of a parsing apart. If it is just my relationship with God, then why would I assume anything? Why would I call myself a disciple? Why would I take a vow? It's because we live in this world, and the external is also real. And if we are, now the way Master describes it is this: if we're so far removed from this world, we're not living in anything that resembles a normal way. We're up in some Himalayan cave living on nettles, or we're a Naga sadhu, wandering covered with ash, not even wearing any clothes. And then we're not participating in the external world at all. But presumably the person who wrote that question, certainly myself, I am participating in the external world all the time. I'm a daughter, I'm a wife, I'm a sister, I'm a seamstress at the present moment making Christmas costumes. I mean, I have 1,000 things. I drive out to the store, I go to the YMCA to go swimming. I participate in this world all the time. In a sense, you could say I have hundreds of roles. So for me to then say, oh, in my spiritual life, I'm just going to be absolutely austere, I'm not going to have any I'm not going to relate to the world of form. That would be slightly hypocritical. I relate to the world of form all the time. So it's what you call using one thorn to pull out another. Because I am acting in the world of form all the time, then I might as well bring into the world of form my inner aspiration. Because then at least in this world of form I will be doing God-reminding things. And vows in that sense are very helpful. You know, we don't take vows for things that we fully accomplished. We take vows as a definition to ourselves of our aspiration. There needs to be some relationship between our reality and that aspiration. A friend of mine was thinking of taking a vow when the Nayaswami order first started, and that person suggested that they would take the Nayaswami vow, which was not appropriate. I said, why? Well, it's the highest vow. Now that's a role. I mean, that's not really attuning oneself to what is one's natural next step. And of course we worked our way through that, and that was not the initiation that was ultimately offered or taken. But the degree to which we allow the forms that we assume as a devotee to be merely external is the degree to which we don't really benefit from them. And the degree to which the form of our life is a spontaneous expression of our actual consciousness, then to that extent we benefit. I, myself, as you see, if you watch more than one of these, I always wear blue, and I'm a Nayaswami. And it's a vow I took in 2009, and it suits me. I haven't realized it, but it suits me. It's the right form for my life to take, and as soon as I saw it, I knew that. But I didn't take it because I ought to, because in my position or because of my years at Ananda or anything. It had nothing to do with any of that. I just looked at that vow and I knew it was the right form for me. Same with the discipleship vow. Same with the marriage vow, for that matter, when I took that. It was the right form for me. It was the right expression of my inner consciousness, or close enough for me to put on the garment and, just hope that I'd grow into it. And one does. One finds oneself on a path like this, and gradually you begin to understand what you've gotten yourself into in a positive way. But naturally you don't know when you start. By definition, you can't know when you start, because making commitments like this change your consciousness. So, I hope it changes your consciousness. I hope you weren't the same person then that you are now after you take such a vow and live it. It in and of itself, it transforms us. So, I think we have a second question now.
My daughter is in pain every minute of the day. How do I pray for her for a long time now?
Wow. My daughter is in pain every minute of the day. How do I pray for her? That's a tough karma. Tough for her and tough for you. Not sure who has it more difficult. These are the circumstances that really challenge our trust in God. I didn't speak yet, but of this aspect of it that Master makes a very important point of when we talk about prayer. Prayer is learning to trust God and learning to feel that we don't have to insist against the evidence. I'm going to pull back for a minute before I answer that more directly. I'm going there. I have a friend, and I didn't know this about her until later, but she was raised by an alcoholic mother, single mom who was an alcoholic. I never experienced anything like that. I didn't even know alcoholics existed until I was in college. I was very fortunate in that. We didn't drink at all. There was no alcohol in the house even, what to speak of that kind of abuse. So I didn't, when the incident I'm going to describe to you happened a while ago, I didn't understand that much about alcoholic parents until later. But the nature of growing up with a parent who's alcoholic, among other things, is utterly unpredictable. You just have no idea. In the case of my friend, you have no idea what her mother would be like or what she would do, and what she would say and what she would really mean, and just everything was chaos. So this woman and I, my friend, she wanted me to help her do something. And I really wanted to help her. She's my friend. I would have helped her. But what she was asking for, it simply was impossible. It wasn't a question of goodwill. It didn't exist. What she wanted me to give her didn't exist. That's how I remember. So she asked me, and I explained to her that it just wasn't going to be possible. So then she asked me again, and then she asked me in a slightly different way. And then she, I think the only word I can use for it is whined a little bit. And then she kind of poked at me, and finally I just became so bewildered. I said, I've answered you, I love you. You're my friend. We've been friends for years. If I could do it for you, I would do it for you. And then gradually I began to understand. She accepted it. Only later did I understand, oh, she was raised by an alcoholic mother. She never knew what her mother would do. And so just because her mother said no or said it was impossible had nothing to do with what reality was. And when she really wanted something, she just had to keep wheedling, because a lot of times all of a sudden, suddenly it was there. Whereas it wasn't there, then it was there. But wheedling in just that kind of a way. And of course, with me, I'm a dharmic person. I'm a person of my word. I'm a true friend. I would have done it for her if I could have. She didn't need to treat me like that. And what was so interesting to me is I felt offended in a certain way. I didn't hold that feeling, but why are you treating me like this? Don't you know that I love you? Don't you understand that if I could do this for you, I would do it in a heartbeat? In this relationship with this girl, it was just a matter of whatever it was. It wasn't there. It couldn't happen. When we're talking to God about what we want, and Master makes this point in many places, that God can't break his own laws. And one of the laws that God has put in place is the karmic law. And if circumstances, require a certain karmic experience, no matter how much we wheedle and whine and want it to be different and ask again from a different angle as if we hadn't brought it up, God can't break his own law. So when you, the person who asked this question, when I or you or anyone find yourself in a position where karma is dictating that something happen, and what this questioner has pointed out is extremely difficult to contemplate. My daughter is in constant pain every minute. Now, of course, you have to begin by understanding that your daughter is really the daughter of Divine Mother, and that no matter how close you feel with your own child, that child is not you. You, as Swamiji put it so clearly, a man and a woman together create a physical body through which a soul can follow the trajectory of its own destiny. But the body is a vehicle for that soul to experience its destiny. And the parents create the body, but they do not create either the soul or the destiny. So if you have given birth to a daughter, and that soul has a destiny now, and that destiny is that much pain must be experienced. It's not, you did not create that destiny, even if I don't know the circumstances, but even if your genetic structure created that destiny, that soul chose that genetic structure so it could have that destiny. And so the first thing I think that you yourself have to understand is that you have to have deep and profound respect for the soul that is your daughter. And not think my daughter. Think rather the soul that is my daughter. The jiva, the individual spark of the divine that existed long before it became my daughter and will go on existing long after that jiva ceases to inhabit the body that is my daughter. And I think that when you pray, you should begin by pulling your consciousness way back from my daughter. And it would probably be a good idea for you not to always call this person my daughter, but call this person by their own name. Because that's the beginning of the right kind of prayer, is that I don't own this soul. I have been invited into a close relationship with this soul, but this is not my daughter. This is a soul. We are two beams, little stars in the sky, and we're traveling very close to each other, but we're not the same star. And there is a destiny here that must be fulfilled. And I can't keep wheedling God to change her karma. What you really want, and this is the prayer that I find most beneficial in these circumstances, you want this soul to understand what it is that God wants from her. You want her to be able to joyfully and completely accept what God wants from her. And if in the moment God is the karmic consequences of past lives have brought your daughter to the point where the necessary learning for this incarnation involves physical pain, you want to trust that Divine Mother knows what she's doing. Now, is that going to be easy? No, of course not. But then this karma is also for you. Is God in charge? Do we in fact live? Does God hold us in the palm of His hand? Is everything that we experience the exact proper culmination of all the karmas that we have generated that have brought us precisely to this point in order that we can grow past our limitations into infinite bliss? It's either always true or it's never true. And this is not easy. The path to self-realization is not easy. To genuinely surrender, to fully realize that the ego with which I identify is not in charge and does not always understand, but there is a divine that is leading us. And that whatever's happening, and I'm not being this sort of fatuous New Age, everything is always perfect. No, I don't mean it like that. I mean that what your daughter is being called to do is a noble destiny brought to her by a loving God. And what you want to pray for, that was your question. How should you pray? You should pray that she have the courage and the devotion and the receptivity to receive whatever God is giving her, and that she herself can lift her vibration to feel and know that Divine Mother is holding her in the palm of her hand. Sometimes I jokingly say when something extremely difficult comes to me or to my friends, "Oh, Divine Mother has taken an unwelcome interest in your spiritual freedom, hasn't she?" And unwelcome by the ego, but always welcomed by the soul. Now, the rest of the prayer is exactly what I've been saying this whole time. Be very, very intimate with God. Tell God every day. But it's different to say, "Oh, Divine Mother, Heavenly Father, you're a father and a mother yourself, and it breaks my heart to see this person suffer. To see my child suffer like that, it breaks my heart. It's almost unbearable." But then Jesus gave us the perfect formula, didn't He? "But thy will, not mine, be done." And if you must add also, "Lord, I want my will to be done, but thy will be done." And you just have to pray that over and over and over again until your vibration changes. And in that changed vibration, you will understand. So, God bless you.